How is the ACCC cracking down on big tech once again?
And what's holding back EV sales in Australia? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists and commentators to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, joined as always by Alex Kidman. Now, Alex, the Artemis 1 mission set off for the moon this week, which is very cool. Now, it's an unmanned mission set to test the rocket and the capsule, but to me, that seems like a missed opportunity. Who do you think we should have shoved on board so we can banish them to the secret ice moon prison?
Well, I don't so much have a who as a what, and I've got to set the scene for this one a little bit because I've been watching a lot more free-to-air TV, and I recently stopped subscribing to YouTube Premium. So, across both mediums, I've been watching a lot more advertising, and really specifically gambling advertising. And oh my God, if I could throw all of those abhorrent gambling ads, both the ones that encourage you to gamble and the ones that whitewash all the ills that gambling causes by saying, oh, but we donate to local sports teams, we're so good. Frankly, Ice Moon Prison's too good for them. I'd put them on the test rockets, the ones that you figure, look, there's a 75% chance these things are going to explode mid-air. Put them on there as soon as possible.
Mate, but you don't watch sport. It's 10 times worse when you're watching sport.
10 times worse, I think, would just push me over the edge. I'd be out there with a chainsaw trying to find them myself.
So speaking of people who like to get out there with a chainsaw, we're joined once again in the virtual Vertical Hold studios by Erin Turner from the Consumer Policy Research Centre. Erin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, and my chainsaw.
So who do you think that you and your chainsaw should have shoved on that rocket for a one-way trip to the moon?
I mean, anyone who does gambling advertising should be on the list. But I'd also put crypto bros up there.
Ah, yes.
Anyone who's told, mum and dad investors, or wherever you want to classify it, to get into this hot new crypto craze and is now leading to people losing millions or billions of dollars, they can go to the moon. They need to go.
They couldn't afford to anymore, though. I mean, that's the thing.
I think some of them would volunteer to this week. I think they put their hand up for it at this point. So Erin's joining us this week to talk about the Australian Consumer Watchdog's latest effort to crack down on big tech and some of those dodgy tech bros who deserve a spot on the rocket. But first, the Consumer Policy Research Centre put out a report this week looking at why many Aussies are hesitant to spend their cash on a new electric vehicle. Erin, what's the story here?
So we asked people, what are the barriers? What's stopping you from taking up an EV, and what would help you get into the EV market? And unsurprisingly, cost is like the number one issue. But also there's some really interesting findings around people are worried about charging and performance, and also market issues. Like, are there enough repair places in my area? Are there enough secondhand cars? Because that's very much a developing market in Australia. So it's early days. There's lots we can do to help people get an EV.
Yeah, I found it interesting digging into some of those figures because there's some stuff that, is kind of expected. As you say, the cost of an EV was right up there. I think it was like 49% of your respondents said the high cost was a problem. But there were other details that I thought were really interesting. There doesn't seem to be much peer pressure around this, for example. It's something like 7% cited not seeing other people like me buying an EV. And it's definitely one of those things that you drop someone into an EV and they sort of get it. And then they look at the sticker price and they go, okay, I won't get it.
Back
away.
Well,
they back away rapidly. I get that too. But that peer pressure doesn't seem to be there in the way that it is for other vehicle or other general purchases.
Yeah, I'd say it's not there yet. If you think about where we are in terms of the EV take-up, not everyone even knows someone with an EV yet. You're still at the point where you might or might not have driven in one. So we're still at that discovery phase. And it means that actually a lot of the efforts we can make here, some of them's in the education space. So just letting people know about the practicalities, what the range is, what's it like to charge. There's some easy solutions, and then there's some much harder things.
So on that list of things, was there anything that jumped out at you that really surprised you?
A lot of it confirmed what we knew, but I think it means that we need to focus on solutions now. Like, people who rent are worried that they're not going to be able to install charging infrastructure at their home. No big surprise. Most people who rent leave every other year. It means we know there's a lot of assumptions in policy debates that EVs will be charged at home. That's not going to be the case for about, I'd say, a third of people, whether it's people in apartments or people who rent or just people who don't have that ability to put that infrastructure in. So if we're serious about really transitioning to EVs, we've got to have a big national conversation about a better public infrastructure charging network.
One of the classics of EVs, and one of those things that just, especially here in Australia, just seems to get recycled over and over and over again, is range anxiety. And all these people who seem to think that every single day they're doing an 800-kilometre round trip. And yes, I do know there are people out there who do have to do that. This is a transitional thing after all. But I found it interesting, the difference between those who had distance concerns regionally versus city-based living, because it was something like 42% of regional users had range anxiety concerns compared to something like 26% of urban users.
Yep, that's it. And look, I think some of that's an educational gap. EVs can actually do a lot right now that people may not realize, but there's also, and I think really rightly, anyone who lives regionally or in a rural area, they know that the market will not always deliver for them. They cannot assume that charging infrastructure will be in their area. They cannot assume that mechanics will be in their area. That's another interesting finding. 23% of people in regions are worried about mechanic access compared to just 13% in urban areas. And I think they're right. And that's where the government needs to step in. We think they should be proactively looking at, like, what are the gaps right now? Where are the equivalent of mobile black spots in our charging and EV support structure, and how do we fill them early? Because that's just going to help the market grow.
The mechanic is a good one, and I hadn't thought, because I know, and most people know how hard it is to find a bloody good mechanic.
That's it.
And when you find one, you hang on to them. So the thought of, great, I've got to go and find another mechanic, and I don't even know the EV mechanics around here, or even if there is one mechanic around here, I hadn't thought of that, but now you've given me one more thing to be worried about.
Although that feels to me like an education issue as much as anything else. And I am coming, as the regular listeners will know, from the perspective of someone who drives an EV. I only drive an EV.
Do you have a mechanic?
Yes, I do. And there's an interesting kind of dichotomy here. You're not wrong. You've got to find a mechanic who's willing to work on it. But the reality is, mechanically, these are much simpler devices. The stuff you're much more likely to hit is very, very regular mechanical work. It's brake pads, it's tires, it's issues with the chassis or rust or, the classic stuff that can go wrong, because the actual motor is so much simpler. You'll never change the oil on an EV. You'll never change a spark plug on an EV. And while I do think there is a need, as Erin was saying, for kind of policy and even for training of people to be ready to do this as that market emerges, the other practical thing to keep in mind is you're probably seeing a mechanic with an EV a whole lot less than you are with a petrol or diesel-powered car.
There's definitely an education gap here. But one of the interesting things you will change on an EV, the battery. And something that came out in the comments of the survey, there's a lot of anxiety around that. Like, how long will it last? What does the replacement cost look like? A bit of that's education, bit of that's thinking about the consumer law there, because it came through loud and clear as something people are worried about.
Going back to the mechanic thing, if I'm a mechanic, that doesn't sound like a good deal for me. Why would I want to get into EVs when I can be making money from schmucks who still drive petrol or diesel cars? Do you think maybe that there's maybe need incentives or transition programs to bring that mechanic workforce and the other infrastructure across, because they're on their own? They might prefer to just milk the old system for as long as they can, especially like if I'm a mechanic now who's 50, I can probably get through till retirement without ever having to touch an electric car.
Yeah, and look, and some people that'll be the right call as, professionals. There's definitely need for a government to think about kind of workforce and support, but also there's interrelated issues here. I feel like this is the perfect show to talk about it. Tech and car infrastructure. I suspect we're going to see, we're going to see more issues with software support than we are necessarily hardware support in EVs. What happens if a major EV provider goes bust and the way that you use it is so tied to software support? That's a really interesting question to think through.
Yeah, the mechanics thing, I mean, it feels to me in a way, it's the buggy whip manufacturer problem. 120 years ago, if you were making buggy whips, you were probably making serious bank, but there was an inflection point at which point it suddenly became not worthwhile, unless you happened to be 50 at that point. So that market is going to shift. We're seeing that internationally, that's happening. And it's a changeover point. I suppose it also represents an opportunity point. while I can say, yes, I've got a mechanic to deal with my EV, I did have to hunt and peck around to find one. That's true. And as such, a bit of competition in that space wouldn't be a bad thing. But equally, if you can say, hey, I'm the only EV mechanic in town, then you've got a certain proportion of business locked in. And most of them are not going to be, I solely do EVs. They'll do both.
That's true. Look, this is all part of, we are at emerging market stage. There's things governments can do to push it along and get us there quicker. And I think that's where there's gains to be had. And it's interesting to think about where government should be investing their time as well. I think there's just so many gains in regional Australia if we get some stuff right.
So where do you think they're doing well or not doing well enough? What's the big thing that needs to happen?
I think about every problem in terms of the consumer law. A woman with a hammer sees every problem as a nail. Look, there's some specific things you can think about in terms of market infrastructure. We want to see a market study, like proactively identify the black spots, proactively think about one day we're going to have much more regulated and I think tightly controlled ways of charging for, how much does it cost me to charge up my car? We haven't really talked about standardization and advertising like we had for fuel, but we're going to have to get there. Other countries have done this. The EU and the UK are like light years ahead. We just need to get on with the work now. And then we need to think about like what happens when something goes wrong. It's really hard to get a complaint dealt with well if you have a dodgy car, a lemon car. We've known this for a long time. It applies to ICE vehicles. It's going to apply to EVs. Basically, you have to go through traditionally the tribunal system, and it's just expensive. You have to pay for your own expertise. It's hard to navigate. We need to have better systems to make complaints about these really big investments. Otherwise, people are going to keep holding back. It's hard to justify a $80,000 investment if you don't have that guarantee that support's there when something goes wrong.
Yeah, one of the other interesting findings that jumped out at me from your report was the percentage of Australians who didn't want to own a car and how that becomes an important part of looking at a broader public transport green initiative where you start bringing EVs into buses and things like that.
Yeah, completely. Because the goal should be getting us off combustion engines. It shouldn't be everyone gets an electric vehicle. I've actually switched. I no longer have a car. I have 2 electric bikes in different areas that I use to get around different places. And I love it. I'm an electric bike person now. And it works for me. There's going to be a range of different varieties and transport modes here.
What percentage of it was people who said that they either don't or don't want to own a car, would prefer not to own a car?
So that was just 6% of Australians, but there was also this interesting kind of, I'd say, other group, largely low-income Australians who aren't even thinking about buying a new car anytime soon. It's just not in their budget. So they're not thinking about barriers to an EV. This isn't a decision for them. And also this other interesting category of older Australians. So people say over 75 they've just bought a new car and they're thinking, no, this is the last one. I'm going to keep it going as long as I can. So there's just going to be a group of people that aren't looking to transition very reasonably.
Yeah, my dad's mate's got a phrase, this will see me out.
Yeah, that's the category.
It to the grave, basically. Literally.
Yeah.
Wow, real Ghost Rider vibes.
So that group, though, I mean, they're looking at a car as a long-term investment, as we all should, basically. And I've made this point before. Cars are terrible investments. They're not particularly cost-effective. But it brings up that financial issue around financial incentives to enable this kind of transition. And we've seen so many different takes on this in terms of rego costs, in terms of travelling in transit lanes, in terms of straight-up cash incentives. What's your take on that? What do you think is likely to work, given what we've seen already?
Look, I mean, one thing isn't going to work. That's probably my main takeaway. It's got to be lots of little things that push different groups of people over the line. Something we're planning to do on the back of this survey research is do some qualitative work next year. So we'll do deep dives with different communities to really understand where they're at. Because I think this is subtle. Like there's going to be a lot of really personal reasons holding different groups of people back. I think the development of a secondhand EV market is going to be really crucial to bringing people along. How do you adapt the current car fleet into EVs, and how do you just get more people? Not everyone buys a new car. We need to think about a market that's really broad and meets more needs for people on lower or just average incomes.
I was going to say that's me. I wouldn't say I was on a low income, but I'm not rich.
No.
But I've never bought a brand new car, and I don't really intend to buy a brand new car if I can get away with it. I wouldn't mind buying an EV, but I can't see how my next car is going to be an EV if it means I've got to buy a new one for $50,000, $60,000. So once they become secondhand, and then you've got a questions. Okay, if I'm buying a secondhand ICE vehicle, I kind of know what I'm in for. What am I in for when I'm buying a secondhand electric vehicle?
That's it. And that kind of gets to those anxieties around battery life, replacement rate, as well as complaints handling. There's some serious issues with secondhand cars and complaints. There's campaigns in Victoria, Queensland, New South Wales, all coming from community legal centres about how many communities are dudded by a really poor secondhand car market out there currently and very bad complaint system. So we've got this problem with ICE vehicles. We should deal with it before we transition to a whole new EV market.
In some ways, I mean, there's some bits of the EV market where that gets a little bit easier, and there's some bits where it certainly doesn't. Because at the moment, that secondhand market in Australia, it's largely people importing vehicles. Lots of cars from Japan, a few from the UK, because there's just wider range or they've been available for longer. And that's certainly where you get a more affordable EV. I'm not going to say cheap. Cheap doesn't exist just yet and won't for a while. But you can at least, because of the way EVs work, you can at least get, a battery state of health report. You can get a bit of a better picture overall relative to a petrol car. But you're not wrong. It's one of those things. And I think, isn't that just a much more a question of time? Because we're so far behind in this market, people haven't had a lot of these vehicles for a lot of time. So there hasn't been that big push to, to have fleets of them. We've discussed this before. Governments picking up fleets of cars and that becoming the secondhand market as well.
Yeah, that's it. This will come in time. But I guess it's also that urgency of, this is one of those major changes all countries need to do to reduce emissions. I think it's really worthwhile to think about how do we shorten the time? How do we leapfrog a little bit where we can? So there's this really interesting, we've been talking to a few of our international counterparts, like Which over in the UK. They've had real challenges with charging infrastructure and interoperability. We haven't seen that in Australia yet. It looks like we've just kind of avoided that problem and other countries have learnt their lesson. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it hasn't been a major concern yet. There are other things we can think about here. How do we avoid the mistakes of other countries? That is the only advantage of moving later than everyone else. So we should learn those lessons.
Yeah, I think we've definitely benefited from being late adopters in that context only, in that by and large, the vast majority of EVs are using a Type 2 system. You've got that kind of Tesla divide where they've got a slightly higher rate network. It has slightly better uptime generally, which I think has probably helped them sell a few vehicles, but that's quite premium priced stuff.
Yes.
But we don't have that much of a concern relative to other places in the world. So actually, Erin, in terms of consumer protections, because you've talked about how there's concerns around existing secondhand ICE sales and things like that. Is there anything else specific for EVs that you think needs to be in there that should become law? Because as we know, the process of getting something into law takes years. So it's something best thought about now, not in a couple of years' time. Are there things that aren't in existing car law that should be in EV car law?
Ooh, look, in some ways, Australia's been thoughtful. There's a really good piece of law that was passed recently around making sure that mechanics can get access to software and data around cars to repair them. That covers EVs. They've kind of future-proofed that really nicely. The consumer law covers everything. It always includes all the markets. But I do think we have a gap around product safety. Our product safety laws, you guys have heard me talk about this before, they're really weak compared to everyone else. And they're definitely, I wouldn't say there's huge issues, but there's definitely always some things to think through with lithium-ion batteries and safety, particularly whether it's charging infrastructure in your home or the battery in cars or other devices. There's risks of safety. And I'd rather we have a really proactive product safety law rather than our weak reactive law that's going to mean that if something goes wrong, we've just got everything there in place.
So, Erin, the ACCC has recently published, I think it's its 5th Digital Platforms Inquiry report. And as always, it's looking into the power and the state of those kinds of digital markets in Australia. What have they put onto the agenda in this particular report of interest?
So, look, a lot of this is around defining what law reform they're looking at. And there's no surprises if you've had the joy of reading these 100-page documents, editions 1 through 4. You can read the
smile on your face tells me that you enjoy this very much.
Weirdly do, sickly do. Look, a lot of it's not surprising, but it is a little bit more specific. So they've got these really nice recommendations about how to reduce scams, deal with complaints on digital platforms because there's not great systems there, deal with a lot of unfair practices, and then the competition element. How do we wrangle these digital behemoths? And we're looking to, there's been some really interesting law reform across the world, particularly in the EU and some states in the US, to start to deal with these competition concerns. And it's Australia's turn. We need to get on it.
So same question, I guess. What do you think's the most important one in there?
Oh, unfairness. So one of their major recommendations is to introduce a broad economy-wide reform called an unfair trading law. Essentially, our consumer law is pretty good. It's not as strong. I obviously have views. It should be much stronger. But there's one really big gap. There's no law against unfair business practices. There's laws against unfair contract terms. So if there's a specific term that you're like, oh, the business is really taking advantage of someone, you can knock that out. But if a business is just like the whole business model is predatory and about abusing their power, nothing really captures that in our law. So as a great example, Amazon, one of our big digital behemoths, an equivalent law in the EU has been used to deal with kind of the Hotel California problem that Amazon lives off. They make it very easy to subscribe. They make it really hard to get out. You've got to jump through lots of hoops and screens. And, oh, don't you want to just stay for another month? Wouldn't you consider half price? The EU's used their laws to make Amazon change their unsubscribe process to a really simple two-stage process. The same dodgy Hotel California dark patterns are being used in Australia on Amazon. We don't have the tool to stop them. So that's one of the things the ACCC wants, and we think it's exactly what Australia needs.
But in their defense, they would argue that lots of businesses do that. Wait, don't go. I can change.
Yes, lots of businesses do that, but they shouldn't.
But where do you draw? But maybe they should, because maybe they go, I can change. I'll drop the price, and you go, yeah, actually, that's the problem. Like, where do you draw the line? Is it unreasonable
just
for
form
them?
digital haggling, I guess.
Yeah, is it unreasonable of them to make some attempt to hang on to you? And where do you draw the line?
Where do you draw the line? Yeah, look, because it's not a black and white issue at all times. So the Amazon process still has 2 stages, and it can still say, hey, we can offer you a cheaper price. But the Australian process, it's about 5 or 6 screens.
That's getting a bit much.
Yeah, exactly. It's about degrees. For me, it kind of goes to the question of, is this large international business abusing its power? And the Amazon case, yeah, I think they are.
A common one I've noticed is that if you want to sign up, whatever, it's easy. But if you want to cancel it, you need to contact them or call them or email. They make it a lot harder process to cancel, where maybe there should be a rule that says you should make it just as easy to cancel through the same medium, the same way as you signed up.
So actually, there's we've raised this with regulators. There's actually a law like that already for credit cards. I worked on this at 2015. Credit cards in Australia, you used to be able to sign up in 60 seconds online.
Yeah.
And then the banks had these ridiculous rules. Like one of them even had this specific rule. You had to cancel by calling a certain group department, which was only available in certain hours. Then you had to cut the card diagonally and post it back to them. And then it was cancelled.
Yeah.
That's the kind of imbalance of power that is actually being used really frequently online. So we can do it in law. California and a couple of the US states are actually looking at laws exactly like what you described. Same way in, same way out.
Yeah.
That's how it should work.
One of the things the ACCC highlighted were the prevalence of scams and fake reviews. And I wanted to drill down on the fake review stuff because as a man who lives and breathes reviews, and I know Adam does as well, the fake thing is really problematic online, isn't it?
It is. And look, I don't think we'll ever be able to fully... It's like with scams generally. This is already illegal behavior. It's already dodgy. You can't deal with 100% of it, but what you can do is ask these big platforms to take more responsibility. Clean up your own backyard so we see less of it.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned Amazon before, and I've bought a few things through Amazon where the product has turned up with a little card in it saying, if you give us a 5-star review, we'll give you a 10% discount on your next thing. And I've just looked at that and I've gone, wow, that is really brazen manipulation. And it's also it might feel like a good deal to the consumer who thinks, oh, I want 10% off. But it's actually a bad deal for consumers generally.
Overall.
Because they then look at, your 5-star review because you wanted the 10%, and it's not actually a reflection of the product.
That's it. And it's also, that doesn't even get into the practices of buying reviews, genuinely fake reviews, just bots putting reviews everywhere. Yeah, there's a lot of dodgy behavior to deal with. And what the ACCC is saying is that basically platforms don't do enough now to stop this behavior and scams generally. Like it's far, you go onto most large platforms, you're going to run into a scam really easily, sometimes some really obvious ones.
Is that because there's no incentive for them to do anything about it?
Yeah, look, they're getting money from these providers. They've got to be pushed. Some of them have done some, I'd say, fairly token efforts to address this problem, but particularly when they've had these, there was a big scandal. David Koch's face was being used on scams. You remember that on Facebook. And, and when very prominent people say, hey, this isn't okay, occasionally they'll scramble and they'll try to fix it. But basically, these companies have the power. They have the ability to control what we see and what we don't. They should use it to make sure the dodgy stuff doesn't get through.
I worry, and this is a terribly specific personal worry. This might not relate to what the ACCC wants to do at all, though. I like the idea of being able to report a fake review, but I've been doing this long enough that you end up with reader complaints. Oh, you didn't review this the right way. Oh, this is terrible. I worry that at some point the ACCC is going to come knocking on my door and say, user 6193572 says that your review of this phone is fake.
Oh, gosh, I hope not. Look, I think what the ACCC's kind of philosophy is in dealing with a lot of this is platforms have the power, they have the money. They're the ones that need to deal with this, which might mean that they put in systems where they knock on your door, not necessarily the ACCC. But yeah, there will ideally be more scrutiny on those reviews.
That can only be a good thing. They also talked about ridding anti-competitive self-preferencing. So what's self-preferencing?
Yeah, look, basically it's when, you buy something on, say, a large platform, Amazon's a good example, and they say, oh, have you considered these things? And they all happen to be from Amazon providers, or just, the things you see are very connected to their platform, or they get a better deal. That's it. It's not, because these companies, there's been a lot of work on this throughout the Digital Platforms Inquiry. These aren't like a traditional company. It's not just like a business. They also are a platform where other businesses sell their goods. So they have a different kind of power. It's kind of equivalent to Coles and Woolies pushing their own brands compared to, say, an independent brand. We just need to make sure that there's no dodgy business in the back end.
But don't Coles and Woolies do that?
Yeah. And so this is the fine art of competition law. It's at what point is it too far? And I think the broad take is that digital platform providers have gone too far. It's how do we rein them in? And what they're proposing, they've got competition law. They can and they are using that. But they're also talking about something, designating digital platforms, not entirely clear who's in and who's out, but basically naming, saying you guys are big behemoths, and then having a code apply to them. So there'd be specific rules around self-preferencing, tying, pre-installation, so what they install, say, on computers or hardware that you have trouble getting rid of because of their power in the hardware market, depending on who we're talking about. It's a little vague exactly what it'll look like, but at its heart, it's about dealing with market power.
Because there's also, I know there's some very large ongoing issues around, to bring Amazon back into the discussion yet again. They've got their Amazon Basics line of just about everything. But there've been a lot of complaints over the years that what they've done is they've looked at what's been successful, be it a messenger bag or a video cable or anything, and said, right, we'll make a version of that. That comes up first, and suddenly the actual originator of the product goes, well, hang on, this doesn't seem fair.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's as much about our consumers seeing a full range of products. Do they get genuine choice? And are small businesses getting a good deal? Particularly, I often think about things from the consumer end, but this really is about a small business and Australian provider end. Quite often you need big digital platforms to reach your customers. If they're choking what people see and locking you out, that really does make a difference.
They're also talking about setting up a digital platform ombudsman scheme.
Yeah.
And look, I've dealt with the TIO, the Telecommunication Industry Ombudsman, many, many times, both as a journalist and personally. And I've had a couple of run-ins with the Insurance Ombudsman, the name of which escapes me for the minute. Financial
AFCA.
Services?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is where I need to own a conflict. I'm on the board of AFCA.
Well, I will shake my fist at you because that was not a fun experience, but that does lead into my concern here, I suppose. I think the idea of having an ombudsman, of having a regulatory body, is not necessarily a bad one. But so often, and again, personal experience bias alert here, the experience of doing it, the experience of actually saying, well, I've got a complaint, of going through with that complaint, is so torturous.
It can be really hard. And look, it depends. There's ways to make ombudsman schemes work well. I can probably talk about this in broad sweeps. In the banking sector, for example, there were 3 different ombudsmen that were brought together to one super ombudsman with more oversight over the whole sector. It's a better outcome. It doesn't mean that it's smooth for everyone, though. Look, an ombudsman really, it's to solve that problem I was talking about earlier around when people go through tribunals, really legalistic processes where you may or may not need representation, you may need to bring evidence. An ombudsman is there to make this process easier and take it out of the courts, to help you ideally get to a smoother, quicker resolution. It kind of goes to the bigger problem we're seeing here in that a lot of these digital platforms don't have very clear dispute resolution processes internally anyway, IDR.
Facebook, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have a complaint, it can often feel like it's going to the void. What an EDR system, external dispute resolution, is meant to do is to give you a way of at least going to an external umpire and say, hey, they're not even listening to me. I need something. It's one way to add an additional layer of accountability overall and also make sure people get help.
But what powers does the umpire have to do anything? I'm just thinking back to when I wrote a lot of stuff about the NBN when people were getting left with no connection for months at a time. And everybody they spoke to blamed somebody else and couldn't help them.
Yeah,
and
there was...
From my memory, the TIOs only had the ability to tell the telco that they should talk to you. And then nothing happened, so you go back to the TIO who'd go back to the telco and say, you should talk to them. Are they all that useless?
Gonna have to own a conflict here. I believe in ombudsman systems when they're designed well and right. And part of that is what's in and what's out.
Yeah.
So there's a really interesting conversation around energy ombudsman, for example, around at what point do you draw the line? Is this just about the electricity market, or does it go to things like dodgy solar panels or issues with my at-home charging? And it doesn't quite yet, but a consumer will obviously, if you're having an issue with something of that nature, you often feel like actually it should fit in an energy ombudsman. Power is power. So part of it is where you draw the lines. And this is actually where the debate around a digital ombudsman gets really interesting. What's in, what's out? Our preference is that it should be as broad as possible. The more you try to cut things in and out, the easier it is for a business to go like, no, we don't deal with this here. You're going to have to go through a really tricky court process instead, or more likely give up. So part of it's that remit. And we definitely had that issue with NBN and the TIO. The more that's in, the more consumers get help and the less arbitrage you see when something goes wrong.
So if Facebook takes down my Facebook page that's my income and got 100,000 followers and won't return my messages and won't tell me why, and I go to the new digital platform ombudsman, are they just going to say, Facebook, you should return their messages and that's it? Or will they actually have the power to force Facebook to do something?
A good quality ombudsman will be able to deal with a complaint. So as a
But is it the ombudsman's fault or is it the law that aren't the ombudsman kind of hindered by what they're told they're allowed to do?
Yeah. So what's in and out that's part of the law.
Yeah.
Some ombudsmen, like to give you an example of what I would say is not even an ombudsman, it's the worst shadow of an ombudsman in Australia, the airline customer ombudsman. So literally all they are is a forwarding service. The only power they have is to say, hey, Qantas, here's an email that you've obviously received before. You should look at it again. That's not an ombudsman in my mind. An ombudsman has to have the ability to make a decision, to have an outcome that the providers are held accountable for. So most ombudsman schemes, there's a decision. A consumer can still go to court if they're not happy with it. There's a process to go like, it hasn't worked for me. I can still go elsewhere. But the business is subject to comply with that decision. That's the great power of an ombudsman.
And certainly in the case, at least of the TIO, who I've written about more than any other, they're industry funded. If you put a complaint to the TIO, the costs of that complaint go to your telco, which should, in theory, incentivize them to fix this up because it's costing them money to not do such a thing. Do you think, and I don't know if that's across the board for the ombudsman scheme in Australia, but do you think a digital ombudsman should have similar kind of things? And if so, who funds it?
Yeah, because it's an interesting one because you want independence, but you also want the ability for basically to send price signals. Like if you're constantly dealing with these complaints, maybe clean up your own backyard and you won't have to pay for these over here in the ombudsman scheme. That's how it should work. So part of it's about getting governance right. making sure that the governance is independent and has representatives with a consumer background there going like, hey, this needs to work for consumers. So that's part of a great ombudsman scheme. But yeah, also part of it is sending those price signals. A lot of the ombudsmen, when their charging model works, that a business will pay more the more complaints that they get, and they'll pay more the individual complaint progresses. So there are incentives in a range of ways to say, settle this, make sure you give the consumer a fair outcome early rather than fight every issue. They should end up having
the consumer
detailed
is not
discussions.
always right. I mean, I suppose that's fair to say.
Exactly. That's what an ombudsman's there to listen independently and kind of both views, but equally the stuff where it just hasn't been dealt with well, that stuff should settle. That the business should just do their job and make sure they comply with the law.
And if the business is doing something dodgy because they just know they can get away with it and they're shafting their customers, and then every time it happens, it costs them money, eventually the cost of doing that dodgy thing will become, no, let's actually just do the right thing so we don't have to pay that overhead.
That's it. Yeah. It's also, you've got to think about how you design this in a way. If you capture small businesses and large businesses, a digital ombudsman gets a little bit easier if we're only talking about the large behemoths, because it's very clear who funds it and how it works that way. But there's also going to be challenges that individuals and small business face on smaller platforms. So who's in and who's out, what's covered and what's not, that's going to be a really important discussion to work through.
It strikes me the devil really is going to be in the detail here. You mentioned certain big outfits being declared, being named as specifically, your Amazons and Googles and so on. But even there can be a lot of fluidity. I mean, you could declare Twitter right now. And let's face it, 6 months ago, that might have seemed like a very, very good bet. 6 months from now, Twitter might be a smoking hole in the ground.
Oh yeah, and do we include, for example, Mastodon or not? We need to think about who's in, who's out, but also the mechanisms to put people in and maybe put groups out as well. This stuff is complex. For example, when every ombudsman scheme that has been set up, it usually takes years to work through the policy grunt and the detail. I think we're at the very beginning of a conversation around a digital ombudsman, but yeah, the ACCC is onto something here. You just have to look at, say, the Facebook complaints void. That there's they don't have the infrastructure and the systems right now to take complaints seriously. They haven't invested in it.
Or the will.
Yeah, that's it. So we need to put in place systems that force them. The best external dispute resolution systems, actually, they make internal disputes, the business dealing with it. They should improve those practices. Ideally, less and less goes to an ombudsman, and the business deals with stuff they should be dealing with proactively.
Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Erin for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Erin, it's once again time for you to face up to the patented, cat-friendly Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. I will ask all 3 and you may answer them in any order you like, and I will say that one of them you have directly inspired. So there's a bit of a teaser. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on whatever remains of social media by the time people are listening to this? And our current big contentious question. What's the worst job you've ever had?
All right. So many. So you can find me online at cprc.org.au. If Twitter is still a thing by the time you're listening to this, I am Erin L. Turner on Twitter. And the worst job I've ever had, I've had so many dodgy jobs. Party fairy is the worst. I was a children's birthday party entertainer during university. It paid well, but not enough to deal with all of the sass I got from 6-year-olds, and literally at one point gum in my hair. So yeah, never again.
6-year-olds at parties can be very grabby. That'd be an awful kind of job, I can imagine.
Look, I respected the parents who would literally lock me outside with a gang of children and go drink inside. That's what I was there for.
That's a great plan if you're the parents.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what I would do now. But yeah, I've done my time as a party fairy. Never again.
Well, I don't think you'll be finding either Adam or I as party fairies anytime soon. But if you do want to find us, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter. At the Vertical Hold Facebook page, we promise we're sorting out a Vertical Hold Mastodon instance at some point, and on the web at verticalhold.com.au.
And as always, thanks everyone for dropping by. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, tell your enemies about us, and help us spread the good word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. That's a good cut point.
Yep. Unless there's, I mean, Erin, I'm sure there's a ton of other things in this.
Oh, yeah. That was just the first half. We'll stop for intermission now.
Oh, okay. Sorry, different hat to my CPRC hat. I think about ombudsman schemes a lot.